Okay, so this is a brief recap or explanation of Yeats' very famous poem Easter 1916. Again, as I mentioned in a previous recording, this is one of his what we call polemical poems. Sorry, I'm having an issue with this, so I'll just... There we go. A polemical poem. In other words, a poem which addresses political or social issues, and a poem in which Yeats, very clear stance on a particular issue is made evident. So in September 1913, he was critical of the materialistic and religious dominated society, individualist society he saw around him in 1913. And he called on, the heroes of the past, or he wondered where they were gone. And he said, well, if they ever returned, they'd be laughed at, or the people would say they were mad. So, of course, that poem was written in the context of, you cannot ignore the historical context of that era. 1913, Home Rule Bill was passed in 1912. Ulster Volunteer Force was formed. 1913, Old MacNeill forms the Irish Volunteers. It looks like Ireland's heading towards civil war in 1914. We know that never happened because of the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914. But by Easter 1916, there's a Republican rising. And Yeats writes this poem as a response to that failed Republican rising that happened on Easter week 1916. A couple of things to note, just in terms of, I'm always in awe of clever people because I'm, not clever myself. And I think it's always interesting to note the structure of this poem. This poem has 4 stanzas. Two of them have 16 lines. And 2 have 24 lines. And the Easter Rising began on the 24th day of April 1916. So it is absolutely correct to say that this poem was written as a memorial, the actual structure, to the rising of 1916. It's very clever. It's an interesting poem in that it's personal, because it's Yeats' response to the events of Easter week. And I'm certainly not going to read the whole poem now. So he begins talking about how he was really surprised by the events because he knew the people involved. I have met them at the close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. Lovely rhythm, rhyming in this poem, as I've mentioned before about Yeats. Excuse me. Them, that's the people who were involved, the insurgents, the rebels that he knew. We'll see them mentioned later on. 18th century houses is a reference to George in Dublin. This is where Yeats lived. This is where Patrick Pearse and Sean McDermott and Countess Markovitz and all those people operated. And he says, he knew them, but he didn't really want to, spend much time with them. So he passed them with a nod of the head or exchanged polite, meaningless words with them. He talks about how he believed that he lived in a place, and this is the first line I would learn from this poem, he believed that he lived in a place where motley was worn. Now, motley is the costume of a clown or a jester. So what he means by that, that's a great example of his use of symbolism. What he means by that is that he believed that he lived in a place and at a time where there were no serious people. In other words, people who might rise above the materialism and the religious restrictions and the individualism of the society to become ennobled by sacrifice. He didn't think there was anybody like that in Ireland, and yet the rising has proved him wrong. And that's what he means when he says he thought he lived in a place where motley was worn. Now, of course, we saw when we looked at September 1913 that repetition is an important part of Yeats' poetry, and the refrain is a feature of 3 poems that I teach on Yeats. This poem, September 1913, and The Stairs Nest by My Window. A refrain is a line at the end of a stanza which is repeated over and over again in order to create emphasis. This refrain is all changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. The repetition of changed, very important. The adverb-verb combination heightens the sense of intensity of emotion. And of course, we have the brilliant, fantastic, intelligent, clever oxymoron. How can something be both terrible and beautiful? This is reminiscent of, for those of you who have me for poetry, when we looked at Elizabeth Bishop's poem, The Armadillo, and she described at the end of that poem the weak mailed fist clenched ignorant against the sky. Here we have a beauty which is terrible. Surely that's a contradiction in terms. Surely something terrible cannot be beautiful and something beautiful cannot be terrible. That's what an oxymoron is. It's a deliberate combination of words which appears contradictory, but in a particular set of circumstances makes sense. And what he's saying in those 2 words, this is the genius of Yeats in my opinion, he encapsulates his complex and conflicted response to the rising in those 2 words, in that oxymoron. He thinks what happened is in many ways beautiful. Men and women with no real hope of winning went out and were willing to sacrifice their lives, not for their self-interest, not in order to try to improve their own individual situation, but because they believed in an ideal and they wanted to try and improve the nation, to make the place a better place. There is no doubt that there's something noble and admirable in that, and that's exactly what he lamented and mourned was missing from Irish society in September 1913. That's the beauty. The terrible is in September 1913, he was hypothesizing and theorizing about violence. In Easter 1916, he's seen the violence. Yeats is a witness to this rising. He's in Ireland at the time of the fighting. This poem is a primary source historical document written by somebody who was there at the time. And he's reflecting on how shocking, bloody, awful war always is. So terrible and beautiful. He commends and celebrates the sacrifice, but he laments and is fearful of the consequences and the loss of life and the suffering. If you knew that, you know this poem. Okay, that's it. The rest of the poem, a couple of interesting things, nothing massively important. We saw in September 1913 how he listed people. He said the wild geese, he said Robert Emmet, he said Edward Fitzgerald, he said Wolfe Tone. He takes the same approach in this poem. The second stanza, he mentions some people that he knew that were involved. The woman referred to in the first 6 or 7 lines of the second stanza is Constance Gore Booth, who he was friends with when he was younger. She went on to marry a Polish nobleman and is known to history as Countess Markiewicz. In the second stanza, he references Patrick Pearse as a man who had kept the school and rode our winged horse. To ride the winged horse is to write poetry. He then refers to Sean McDermott or Sean McDermott as this other, his helper, who he says, oh, actually that's wrong. It's McDonough that he's referring to there. Sorry, I'll just want to put this in now. I'll change that now. It's actually, Tomas McDonough he's referring to. Doesn't matter. He knew Pearse, he knew Markiewicz, he knew McDonough. Later on, he refers to a man he had dreamed a drunken vainglorious lout. That's a reference to Captain John McBride. Captain John McBride was married to the great love of Yeats's life. Her name was Maud Gonne. Captain John McBride and Maud Gonne had a very difficult and tempestuous relationship. So Yeats refers to how he had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart. So in other words, what he's saying is, this guy was a guy I couldn't stand. I hated him. He was violent towards and hurtful towards the woman I love. And yet he says, I still number him in the song because he's dead too. He has been changed in his turn. A terrible beauty is born. Very easy. Nothing difficult. The only slightly complex part of this poem, and I would certainly say the only part of the poem that I would definitely try to learn besides the refrain, is the first 4 lines of the third stanza. The third stanza becomes figurative, and it's built around something that we see over and over again in Yeats' imagery, and that is nature images. Nature images feature, I'm just going to do this, and the image of the heart. And the heart, of course, over and over again in Yeats' poetry, we see reference to the heart, and that's a motif. A motif is any aspect of a poet's work or any artist's work, whether it be thematic concerns or aspects of style, which you see repeatedly and kind of join up the different parts or the different pieces of work produced. And what he says is, hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. And there you have a direct connection to 2 poems, The Stairs Nest by My Window and The Second Coming. In The Stairs Nest by My Window, he talks about how too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. And also in that poem, he said, that's in this poem, he said, we fed the heart on fantasies, set the heart's grown brutal from the fair. So he's talking about fanaticism. And in The Second Coming, he thinks about the reality of fanaticism and how dangerous it is when he describes the sphinx-like figure with a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. So in this case, we have the heart image representing feeling. If your heart has one purpose alone, then you are a fanatic. So somebody who is devoted to one goal in life and is willing then to sacrifice everything else to get that goal, which makes you dangerous. He is saying that he believes that the rising will give birth to a new generation of fanatics who will never rest through summer and winter seem in their pursuit of this goal. And he says their hearts will become stones and they will trouble the living stream. And the heart becoming a stone means that they will become cold-blooded and cruel. And anybody who knows the history of Irish republicanism, which was really born 20th century republicanism, modern Irish republicanism, was really born in Easter week of 1916. And anybody who knows the history of it will know that there were terribly cruel, brutal acts committed all the way up even to the present day in the name of the Republic. So here we see Yeats' foresight, worrying about what the consequences of Easter week might be. And he's saying that he thinks that the heart that's turned to stone will trouble the living stream. And the living stream is a metaphor that represents the future, constantly changing and moving like a stream. And what he's saying, showing what we call prescience, which means the ability to look at a data set, if you like, or to look at a set of circumstances and predict what's going to happen next. What he's saying is he thinks the 1916 Rising is going to give birth to a new generation of violent fanatics who will cause a lot of trouble in the future. And my goodness me, was he right. So there you go, the nature imagery, the summer and winter, the living stream, and then this wonderful, wonderful, I'm not going to go into it now, students find it very difficult, beautiful piece of aesthetic writing in which he imagines the life of a stream with birds and the water moving and the clouds moving above and the passage of time. And he uses repetition of minute by minute, minute by minute, minute by minute in order to emphasize the constantly changing nature of life and circumstances and politics and social situations. But he says that in the heart of it, the stone will be there, never changing. So the stone is the fanatic. And what Yeats is saying is, no matter how much circumstances change, we are going to have Republican fanatics in our midst, he thinks, for a long time, who will be willing to kill and be killed. And while he admires the sacrifice of the rebels of Easter week, he worries about that precedent that they have set about the taking of life and the sacrifice of life in the interest of a political ideal. The last stanza has that famous line that I misspoke earlier and said it was from a different poem. It's from this poem. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. The more we suffer, the crueler we become, he thinks. And then he goes on and he talks about, his response to the rising. And finally, just as in September 1913, he lists out the names MacDonagh and MacBride and Connolly and Pearse, now in a time to be, wherever the green is worn, wherever there are Irish people, are changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. So a brilliant, famous poem, a polemic, in which Yeats discusses the political fallout of the Easter 1916 Rising and his own personal response to the Easter 1916 Rising in measured, passionate, imaginative language, in which he uses symbolism like the stone, like the living stream, like the motley, like the terrible beauty, to communicate in an interesting and memorable way his thoughts and feelings about this event.